The United States Supreme Court has just issued a massive ruling that could completely reshape how federal courts block presidential policies across the entire country. And the fallout from this one is already exploding because it directly collides with one of the most controversial constitutional fights in America right now, birthright citizenship. In a huge
Tuesday, June 30th, and here's our big story. The Supreme Court has ruled against President Trump's bid to end birthright citizenship, a major defeat for one of his core policy goals. The court upholding the 14th Amendment's traditional interpretation, confirming that children born on U.S. soil, including those born to undocumented immigrants, are U.S. citizens. Devin Dwyer explains.
In a huge decision, the Supreme Court ruled that federal judges do not have the authority to hand down sweeping nationwide injunctions that instantly freeze a federal policy for everyone in America with the stroke of a pen. And if you think this is just some technical legal fight buried deep in the courts, think again, because this ruling does not just affect one immigration case. It changes the legal battlefield for almost every major constitutional showdown moving forward. It affects how states sue the federal government, how activist groups challenge executive orders, how lower courts try to stop a president's agenda, and how fast a policy can be blocked before the Supreme Court ever gets a final say. And because this ruling came in the middle of the fight over President Trump's birthright citizenship order, the shockwave from this decision is immediate, nationwide, and potentially historic. Now, what makes this even more explosive is that the Supreme Court did not actually decide whether the birthright citizenship order itself is constitutional. That part is still unresolved. Instead, the court focused on something just as powerful, maybe even more powerful in the short term, which is whether one lower court judge can issue an order that stops a federal policy everywhere in the country, including in places and against people who were never even part of the lawsuit. And the court's answer here was no. That is the earthquake. That is the part that is sending panic through the legal system right now. Because for years, nationwide injunctions have been one of the most powerful weapons used against presidential administrations from both parties. Lower courts would step in, issue a broad order, and freeze enforcement across the entire country before the case had even fully played out. But now the Supreme Court's conservative majority has stepped in and said that practice goes too far. Now, before we break down what the Supreme Court just did, why this is so significant, and what this means for birthright citizenship and many other legal battles moving forward. If you like this type of content and you want clear breakdowns of these major Supreme Court decisions as they happen, make sure you subscribe to the channel right now and turn on all notifications so you never miss any of these updates when I release them. Also, if you appreciate this type of reporting and analysis, make sure you hit the like button because that helps push this video out to more people who want to stay informed on what is actually happening with the court and the Constitution. Now, to understand why this ruling matters so much, you have to understand how this entire fight got to the Supreme Court in the first place. President Trump issued an executive order targeting birthright citizenship, specifically attempting to deny automatic citizenship to certain children born in the United States to parents.
About this decision, walk us through the ruling.
I think that's right. So this ruling was frankly closer than I had predicted, but a majority of the court did say that President Trump's attempt to redefine birthright citizenship by executive order is improper.
To parents who are either in the country illegally or only temporarily. The order immediately triggered lawsuits from multiple states and legal organizations, and those challengers did what challengers almost always try to do in cases like this. They ran into federal court and asked judges to shut the entire policy down across the whole country before it could ever take effect. And that is exactly what happened. Lower courts issued broad rulings blocking enforcement, not just for the people and parties directly involved in the cases, but on a nationwide basis. That sent the issue back up to the Supreme Court. But here is where things took a very important turn. The Supreme Court was not being asked, at least at this stage, to fully resolve whether Trump's birthright citizenship order violates the Constitution. Instead, the justices were asked to decide a narrower but still enormously important question. Can a federal district judge issue a universal injunction that blocks a federal policy against everyone nationwide, even people who are not before that court? That is the issue the Supreme Court decided, and the answer from the court was that federal judges do not have that kind of sweeping authority. Justice Amy Coney Barrett wrote the ruling, and the majority made clear that judges are supposed to resolve the disputes of the parties before them. not act like national policymakers controlling the entire federal government from one courtroom. That distinction is critical because it means the Supreme Court just placed real limits on one of the most aggressive tools lower courts have been using for years. A nationwide injunction sounds simple enough on the surface. A plaintiff sues the federal government, wins in front of a district judge, and that judge issues an order saying the policy cannot be enforced against anyone, anywhere in America. But what the Supreme Court is now saying is that this goes beyond the traditional role of the judiciary. The court's conservative majority is essentially arguing that lower courts are not supposed to supervise the entire executive branch nationwide every time a controversial policy gets challenged. Their role is to decide the case in front of them and provide relief to the parties before them, not instantly rewrite the national legal landscape from the bottom of the judicial ladder. And that is why this ruling has such massive implications. Think about it this way. If one district judge in one part of the country can freeze a federal policy nationwide, then the executive branch becomes vulnerable to a single courtroom, a single judge, and sometimes a single plaintiff strategy designed specifically to shop for a favorable jurisdiction. The Supreme Court clearly signaled that it sees that as a serious problem. The majority agreed with the broader argument that federal judges have been overreaching with universal injunctions. That is the major institutional message coming out of this case. The court is reining lower courts back in and telling them they cannot keep using these sweeping national orders so casually. Now, of course, this immediately creates a second question, and it is the question that has everyone laser-focused right now. If the Supreme Court limited nationwide injunctions, what happens next to the Birthright Citizenship order? And this is where the fallout becomes very real. The court did not bless the policy on the merits. It did not say the policy is constitutional. It did not say Trump automatically wins. Instead, the court sent the cases back down to the lower courts and told those judges they now have to tailor their orders to fit the actual parties and legal boundaries in front of them. In other words, the lower courts can no longer simply block the order for the entire country in the broadest possible way based on the kind of injunctions they had issued before. But that does not mean the order goes into immediate full nationwide effect tomorrow. In fact, the Supreme Court's ruling specifically indicated that enforcement cannot begin for another 30 days. That window matters because it gives the lower courts time to adjust their orders, and it gives the challengers time to continue fighting over how broad the relief can still be under other legal mechanisms. So even though the administration scored a major procedural win here, the practical reality is that the legal war is far from over. This thing is not resolved. It is entering a new phase, and that phase may become even more chaotic. Why chaotic? Because once nationwide injunctions are off the table, or at least significantly restricted, you open the door to the exact kind of patchwork legal landscape that many critics warned about. You could have one set of rules in the states that challenge the order, a different set of rules elsewhere, and ongoing confusion about who is covered, who is not covered, and how federal agencies are supposed to apply the policy while litigation is still unfolding. That is one of the biggest immediate consequences of this decision. Instead of one broad national freeze, you could now have fragmented litigation with different courts crafting narrower remedies, possibly leaving different regions under different legal realities until the merits are finally decided. And that is where this becomes such a major story for ordinary Americans, because birthright citizenship is not some obscure regulatory issue buried in administrative law. This goes directly to the meaning of citizenship, the 14th Amendment, executive power, immigration enforcement, and the role of the courts in checking the president. The merits question is still looming over all of this, and it is a huge one. The 14th Amendment says that persons born in the United States and subject to its jurisdiction are citizens of the United States. That language has long been understood as the constitutional anchor for birthright citizenship. The administration's order is testing the edges of that understanding, and the lower courts had moved aggressively to block it. But now the Supreme Court has stepped in and changed the way that challenge can proceed. So what the court did here was not minor. It did not just shuffle paperwork. It did not just tweak a legal standard on the margins. It changed the litigation leverage. It changed the battlefield. Before this ruling, challengers to a presidential policy could race to court, secure a favorable district judge, and potentially shut down the policy nationwide before the merits were fully litigated. After this ruling, that path is far less automatic. Challengers may still win injunctions, but the relief may need to be more closely tied to the actual plaintiffs and parties before the court. That means less instant national paralysis for the executive branch and more pressure for the Supreme Court itself to eventually step in and resolve the underlying constitutional questions. And if you have been following the court closely, this ruling fits a larger pattern. The Supreme Court's conservative majority has shown increasing frustration with what it sees as lower court overreach, especially in politically charged cases where district judges issue sweeping rulings with nationwide consequences. The justices are not only policing executive power anymore, they are also policing the judiciary itself. They are sending a message to lower courts that there are structural limits to what judges can do, even when they believe a policy is unlawful. In the majority's view, the answer is not for one district judge to seize national control of the issue. The answer is for the legal process to move through the courts properly, with relief tailored to the parties and the higher courts resolving the broader constitutional question in due course. Now, predictably, critics of this ruling are already warning that the decision weakens judicial oversight and gives administrations more room to push legally questionable policies while cases crawl through the system. And to be fair, that concern is not imaginary. If a policy can only be blocked in a more limited way, some people may remain subject to it while the courts continue sorting things out. That is one of the deepest tensions in this case. The majority sees nationwide injunctions as a dangerous distortion of judicial power. The critics see them as a necessary tool to prevent unlawful federal action from spreading and causing broad harm before the courts can fully review it. That clash is not going away. In many ways, this ruling intensifies that debate instead of ending it. And this is why the birthright citizenship fallout is so huge. Because the issue now is not simply whether one order stands or falls. The issue is whether the courts can still use the same emergency braking system they have relied on for years to stop federal action nationwide. The Supreme Court has now placed real limits on that system. So even though the constitutional merits of the birthright citizenship fight are unresolved, the administration has already won something very substantial. It won a ruling that may make it harder for lower courts to freeze presidential policies at a national level in future battles. That matters for immigration. It matters for executive orders. It matters for federal regulation. It matters for constitutional litigation from here on out. Now let's talk about the political implications because they are enormous. If lower courts can no longer easily issue universal injunctions, then presidents may have more room to move aggressively with controversial policies, at least for a period of time, while litigation plays out. That means administrations may be more willing to test legal boundaries, knowing that one district judge cannot as easily shut everything down nationwide. On the flip side, states and activist groups challenging those policies may have to rethink their legal strategy. Instead of racing for one national injunction, they may need broader plaintiff classes, multiple coordinated suits, or other ways of structuring relief. In plain English, this decision just changed how power is contested in federal court. And for viewers who follow these issues from a constitutional perspective, this ruling also says something deeper about the court's current philosophy. The majority appears determined to pull power back toward what it sees as the proper constitutional lanes. The executive executes. The judiciary resolves concrete disputes. Lower courts do not operate as roaming national veto points. That is the structural vision underneath this ruling. Whether you agree with that vision or not, that is clearly where the court is moving. And when you combine that with the court's recent willingness to step into major fights over immigration, elections, executive power, and constitutional rights, you can see why this ruling is being viewed as such a turning point. Now there is another reason this case matters, and it is something a lot of people are overlooking. Even though the Supreme Court limited nationwide injunctions, the merits of the birthright citizenship order are still alive and very much in play. That means the administration's win here could still be temporary if the lower courts eventually rule against the policy on constitutional grounds and the Supreme Court later agrees. So no one should confuse this procedural win with a final resolution of the citizenship issue itself. The court did not settle the 14th Amendment question here. It left that issue for another day. And that means the underlying constitutional battle is still coming. That is important, because you are going to hear a lot of exaggerated takes from both sides. Some people are going to say this means the Supreme Court upheld the birthright citizenship order. That is not accurate. Others are going to say the order is dead and this ruling changes nothing. That is also not accurate. The truth is more powerful and more complicated. The court gave the administration a major win on the remedy question, limited the authority of lower courts to impose nationwide blocks, and sent the cases back for further proceedings, all while leaving the ultimate merits unresolved. That is why the fallout is so significant. This is not the end of the fight. It is a major rewiring of how the fight happens. And this is where the tension inside the country is only going to rise. Because once you move away from universal injunctions, people start asking very practical questions. What happens if one federal court protects some plaintiffs but not others? What happens if a family in one state is covered by a court order and a similarly situated family elsewhere is not? What happens if federal agencies are trying to apply one policy across the country while being restrained in some jurisdictions but not others? Those are not abstract law school questions. Those are real administrative, constitutional, and human questions that lower courts may now have to navigate in real time. This also puts much more pressure on the Supreme Court itself. If lower court relief becomes more fragmented and the legal landscape starts breaking into regional pieces, the justices may have to step in sooner rather than later to resolve the underlying merits. In other words, by limiting the power of lower courts to issue sweeping nationwide rulings, the Supreme Court may actually be increasing the chances that more of these major policy disputes end up back in front of the justices for full resolution. That means more national showdowns, more direct Supreme Court involvement, and potentially more landmark rulings on constitutional questions that had previously been frozen in the lower courts. And if you look beyond birthright citizenship, the reach of this ruling is hard to overstate. Future presidents from either party are going to be affected by this. Immigration actions, environmental regulations, agency enforcement changes, speech policies, election rules, health mandates, federal funding conditions, all of these can end up in the same procedural framework. Can one district judge block it for everyone, everywhere? After this ruling, the answer is now much more limited than it used to be. That is why so many legal observers are treating this as one of the most consequential procedural rulings in years. Now, from a viewer retention standpoint, here is the part you really need to keep your eyes on over the next several weeks, because this is where the next major developments are going to happen. First, watch what the lower courts do during that 30-day window. They are now under pressure to reshape their orders and decide how broad relief can still be without running afoul of the Supreme Court's ruling. Second, watch how the administration moves. If it believes the lower courts can no longer block the policy in the same sweeping way, it may push aggressively once the clock runs out. Third, watch for a fast return trip to the Supreme Court. If the lower courts try to craft broad relief through a different route, or if the challengers reorganize the case around class-wide remedies or state-specific relief, this could be right back in front of the justices very quickly. And politically, this is going to feed a much larger argument already happening in the country about who really governs, elected officials or unelected judges. The administration and its allies are going to frame this as a huge check on judicial overreach, a ruling that stops single district judges from hijacking national policy. Opponents are going to frame it as a dangerous weakening of the court's ability to protect constitutional rights quickly and uniformly. Both sides are going to use this case as proof of their broader narrative. That is why the ruling is not just legally important. It is politically combustible. I also think this case is going to intensify the public's focus on the structure of the federal judiciary in a way many people do not usually think about. Most Americans do not spend their time worrying about injunction scope, party-based relief, or the historic limits of equitable remedies. But once those ideas start determining whether a major policy can be stopped nationwide or only in scattered pieces, people begin to realize just how much procedural law shapes real life. That is what makes this case such a big deal. It is not only about birthright citizenship, it is about how constitutional power is checked in modern America. And let me say this clearly, because this is where some of the biggest confusion comes in. The Supreme Court did not close the courthouse doors. Challengers can still sue. Lower courts can still issue relief. Policies can still be blocked. But the court is saying that relief has to be tied more carefully to the judicial role and the parties before the court. That is the line the justices are trying to draw. Whether that line is workable in practice is exactly what we are about to find out. Because once judges start trying to implement this in politically explosive cases, every ambiguity is going to matter. So the bottom line is this. The Supreme Court just delivered a major ruling limiting nationwide injunctions, And because that ruling landed inside the birthright citizenship fight, the consequences are immediate and massive. The administration gets a significant legal win. Lower courts lose some of their broadest blocking power. The merits of the citizenship order remain unresolved. A 30-day clock is now running. And the country could soon be staring at a patchwork legal map while the biggest constitutional question in the case still hangs in the air. That is why this ruling matters so much. It is not the final chapter, but it may be one of the most important chapters in the whole battle. So now the question becomes, where do you think this goes next? Do you think the lower courts will find a way to keep broad blocks in place through narrower rulings? Do you think the Supreme Court is right to rein in nationwide injunctions? And do you think the birthright citizenship issue itself is now on a direct path back to the High Court for a final constitutional showdown? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, because I really want to hear where you think this case is heading next. And if you want more updates on this case, on the Supreme Court, on major constitutional battles, and on the biggest political and legal stories shaping the country right now, make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and stay locked in because this story is far from over. And I will keep bringing you the breakdowns as the next developments happen. But as always, thank you so much for all of your support.